Hi everyone, my name's Layla Mahmood and welcome to the fourth and final webinar of this series focusing on the fundamentals of rate transient analysis. Now in this series, in previous webinars, we've taken a look at traditional methods of analysis as well as the pseudo-steady-state inflow equation. We've also taken a look at some RTA tools such as your type curves and your flowing material balance. Now in today's final webinar, we're going to be taking a look at an introduction to modelling. We'll take a look at some analytical models and numerical models, as well as some multiple well models, and we'll jump into the software and take a look at some workflows. So let's start by introducing the concept of modelling. Now previously, what we've been doing is actually building a story. So what data analysis is, in order for us to get reliable results, we want to build a story as we have done here. So it's always a good idea to start off with diagnostics. Now, your diagnostics is your data validation and your reservoir signal extraction, and this can be done using data charts and type curves, which we've taken a look at in a previous webinar. After diagnostics, it's a good idea to then go on to interpretation, and this involves your flow regime identification and estimating your reservoir characteristics, so you can identify some important system parameters and qualify your uncertainty. And you can do your flow regime identification by using methods such as your type curves, and you can also estimate your reservoir characteristics using RTA tools such as your flowing material balance. Now, once we've done our interpretation, we can then move on to modelling and history matching. And this includes validating your interpretation and optimizing your solution. And you do this using both analytical and numerical models. Now, you can see that there's a forward arrow and a backward arrow between interpretation and modelling. And this is because this can be done multiple different times until you get a model that you're happy with. It could be that once you've done your interpretation, you then put those results or parameters into your model, but you're not happy with your history match. So then you want to go back to your interpretation and change some parameters around and put them back into your model until you get a history match that you're happy with. And finally, you have your forecasting. And this is where you can forecast your reserves and you can optimize your scenarios. So for example, you could add in aquifers if needed, you could identify infill potentials, and this is all done at the end of the story. So the section of the story that we're going to be focusing on in today's webinar is modelling. And once you have your drainage area, you've got your reservoir characteristics, such as your permeabilities, your fracture half lengths perhaps, you can then go ahead and build a model with this information. And what we're seeing here is how an analytical model will look in Harmony Enterprise. So at the very top, we have the simulated average reservoir pressure, which will decrease over time. These are our measured gas rates and pressures, and the red line here represents our simulated gas rates. Now, with the reservoir signal parameters that we've extracted through our interpretation, what the software does is try to recreate a simulated rate that overlays onto your measured rate, indicating that we have a good history match to our production data. It's also important to note that you can actually create a history match not only to your rates, but to your flowing pressures as well. And the final step of the story that we had a look at is forecasting. So once we have a close match, we can run production forecasting and determine reserves. And we can also do optimization scenarios. We can run forecasts under different constraints and different situations to help us predict how things might change under different conditions. Now we can forecast holding constant pressure or ramping pressure down, or holding our rates constant or ramping our rates down. So there are many different options when it comes to forecasting. Now the history matching of models is a forward and backward process where you have your data, and after your interpretation and analysis, you can put it into a model and get your results. But you may not be happy with the history match created by the model, so then you'd be required to go back and manipulate the data until you get results that you're happy with, and you can do this a number of times until you're happy with your results. Now, taking a look at some theory behind analytical models. Now, analytical models do have some great advantages, and one of them is that they have very short calculation times, and that means that you can actually get the results that you're looking for and output those results very quickly. Now, modeling makes use of all the information within a dataset. For example, while analyzing data from vertical wells, the person analyzing it might try and determine permeability in skin by analyzing the data points that make up the semi-log straight line on a radial plot. But they might end up ignoring the data points in the transition period between the wellbore storage and the radial flow. Now, models make use of the information contained in transition periods. With modeling, you can simultaneously analyze multiple different flow periods so that a single set of parameters can be found. Now, we also have the automatic parameter estimation. Now, parameters can be optimized using the APE or the automatic parameter estimation. Before using the APE method, all the corrupted data should be removed from the dataset to prevent the attempt to match invalid points. And what the APE does is it allows you to choose the parameters that you'd like to iterate on in order to gain a better history match. Now, there are some important limitations of your analytical models. The first is that it's just applicable for single phase. So for liquid flow, the fluid properties are assumed to be constant, and for gas flow, you have the pseudo-time effects under limited circumstances. And we do have a numerical model that will help us to overcome these limitations. Now here we can see an example of analytical models in the Harmony Enterprise software. You have your parameters section where you can enter your parameters, and here you can also select the parameters that you'd like to iterate on and select the APE. We have the schematic, which is where you can visualize your model schematic. The history plot is where you can actually see the history match and you can maximize each of these plots. You have the Blasingame, which is the type curve plot with different derivatives shown, and you have your type curve, so just a simple log-log plot. Now here we can see a history match plot for analytical models. You have the historical gas rate, the historical sand phase pressure, the simulated sand phase pressure, and an average reservoir pressure. So what we can actually see here is that we're trying to create a match between our pressures. So the simulated sand phase pressures, or bottom hole flowing pressures, are trying to be matched with their actual pressures, or the historical sand phase pressures. So now let's jump into the software for an example of a gas well workflow where we will also be creating an analytical model. So we've jumped into the software for this example. This is a vertical gas well which has been hydraulically fractured. And let's start by taking a look at the diagnostics. When I take a look at my diagnostics, we can see that I have applied my gas rate here. We have around 2 years of production history, and we can see that the gas rate dropped and then kept producing, so it continued to produce. Now we can also apply our surface flowing pressures on the diagnostics plot. And when I do that, we can see that perhaps a pressure increase in the pipeline caused a back pressure to occur and that rate to drop by a little bit. Now, your daily production history is typically all that's needed for this kind of work. So now let's take a look at some other data that we have already imported into the software. I'm going to start off by going into my Editors tab. Now my Editors tab is where all of my PVT properties and reservoir properties lie in the software. We also can see our wellbore configuration. We can see our wellbore schematic in TVD, and you can use this for unit conversions to bottom hole pressure as well. You can see that different pressure loss correlations can be chosen, and you have a little tip next to them about the conditions that they were developed under. Also, the flow path can be selected, so the correct bottom hole pressure based on the flow path is always being calculated. Now, if I go back to the Properties tab, what reservoir properties are needed to begin doing the RTA work? Now, we need initial estimates of reservoir pressure. We need net pay and porosity. And you also need your saturations, things like your gas gravities, etc., all entered by default. You can also select your PVT correlations here in this tab as well. Now if I go down to production, this is where all of the production data lies. And you can also see that we have an automatic calculation where you can calculate your conditions down to bottom hole conditions automatically in the software as well. And finally, you have your static pressures tab. And if you had any static pressures, this is where your static pressures would lie. So let's go ahead and conduct a more in-depth reservoir analysis. Now, we've taken a look at already in the webinars the theory behind type curves and flowing material balance. So this is what we're going to start off by doing. Now, if you remember, rate transient analysis incorporates both your rates and your flowing pressures to understand the reservoir and to create reliable forecasts. So we've already taken a look at our flowing material balance and our type curves. So let's start off with that. Now, if you remember, the static material balance, the goal is to find the initial gas or fluids in place with different shut-ins to see how much pressure builds up. But the problem we have is that you have to shut in the well. Now, with the flowing material balance, you're using your rates and your flowing pressures to come up with the same results to find the initial gas and fluids in place, but you have the added advantage that you don't need to shut in the well. So I'm creating my FMB. And you can see that when I select my flowing material balance, the data is curved and then it goes straight. And this shows that the well was initially in transient flow, and then the straight line represents boundary dominated flow. Now, the FMB has been used for many different years and is quite reliable because to do a static build-up, it can take weeks or months for the pressure to stabilize in low permeability. But with this, we're using production data so we can contact a lot more of the reservoir. And you can see the results of your FMB on the left-hand side here. We can also apply our productivity index. And when I select that, this actually monitors the health of the well. So the fact that this is flat suggests that the health is not changing. We don't have any skin changes or any pressure interference from any of the other wells. Now, if there is pressure support from aquifer or from water drive, the PI would actually increase. So what results are we getting from our FMB? We can see that we have an original gas in place of around 3 BCF, and we have an EUR of around 2 BCF based off of an 80% recovery factor. So the next step then would be to go ahead and do a type curve analysis. So I can simply select my worksheet and go to my type curves. Now, similar to pressure transient analysis, type curves are great to help identify flow regime as well as getting your key parameters such as your permeability, your skin, your fracture half length, and remember they're dimensionless models between the reservoir and the well. So we're going to start off with the Blasingame type curve. We've taken a look at the theory behind the Agarwal-Gardner, the Blasingame and the Fetcovich type curves in a previous webinar. So the Blasingame type curve is based on the Bordet derivative, and you can find other options in the options icon here next to the filler. Now, the top half of this type curve, if you remember, represents transient flow, and the bottom half of this type curve represents boundary dominated flow. And what I can do is move my data to where it fits on the type curve, and I can simply select my automatic type curve selection. And what this will do is it will actually generate out my results or my bulk parameters on the left-hand side here. So you can see your permeability, your fracture half length, and your original gas in place. So in this case, we can see that we've got a permeability of around 0.76 millidarcy and an original gas in place of around 2.7 BCF, which is similar to the FMB where we were getting 3 BCF. Now, the type curve here shows if the data keeps following the boundary dominated trend, it would suggest that no energy is lost out of the reservoir into another well and no extra energy is entering the reservoir from pressure support. So the data would actually deviate from the boundary dominated line if this was to occur. But you can see in this case that it follows the trend quite nicely, so there's no deviation from the trend. Now we can also plot the Agarwal-Gardner type curve. And this just represents the data in a slightly different format. And when I plot this type curve, I can actually select my type curve, and the beauty of the Agarwal-Gardner type curve is that I can enable my transient boundary diagnostic, and this will show me exactly which points are in boundary dominated flow and which points are in transient flow and the transition between these, and I can actually annotate this using my labels to tell me exactly which point I transitioned. Now, the next step then would be to generate a reservoir models. We have both single phase and multi-phase numerical models. We're going to start off with just a single phase analytical model. So I'm going to create a new worksheet, and I can simply select my gas analytical model. So models can be sometimes very intimidating as there's so many inputs and so many unknowns. Now, what we want to do is we want to let the data speak for itself and guide us to these inputs. So we use these diagnostics, such as the FMB and the type curves, as we've just taken a look at, as they're actually giving us our initial model parameters to help us to initiate our model. So what we can do is we can actually seed in those parameters that we're getting from our FMB and from our type curves. So we don't have to keep entering our data in. So if I just select my Blasingame type curve to bring in that data, I can just put in a skin factor of 0. So you can see that I've applied my skin, my permeability, and my drainage area, all of these from my Blasingame type curve. And that gives me my initial model here. So I have my area, my well in the middle, and below I have my history match. And you can actually maximize the history match. And we can see that the history match is not doing very well. It doesn't match very well. So what does this history match show us? I'm just going to put on the legend here. So the red dots here are representing the gas rate that the well had produced at. The brown dots represent the bottom hole flowing pressures at the end of the tubing that the well operated at. Now this brown line is actually our model pressure, and we can see that it doesn't perfectly match the real pressure that the well has experienced. So we actually need to start tweaking our inputs. And usually, if we start by adjusting the permeability and the fracture half lengths, this will sometimes give us a little bit of a better match. So let's try doing this. Now you can see through trial and error how by tweaking these inputs will make a difference to the history match. Now I've increased it slightly and you can see how it still hasn't matched. I can then decrease it slightly and see that we're getting a little bit of a better match. I can also play with the fracture half length and see how this will actually change my match. Now another thing that we can do is we can select the parameters that we'd like to history match on, and we can actually use the automatic parameter estimation. Now, it's always recommended to try and do this manually first to see which inputs are the most sensitive. So here you can see I've selected my permeability and my fracture half length, and I can simply select my automatic parameter estimation, and this will now allow the software to automatically tune these variables to give me the best match. Okay, and we can see that we're getting pretty close now. I've noticed that perhaps the latter part of the curve doesn't match as good. So this is usually a volume issue. So I can just adjust my volume very slightly here. So that's good. I'm happy with that. So this has been used to look at the past. Now let's take a look at the same model to predict the future production using the Darcy's flow physics model. So what we actually have is a forecast tab. So I can do, for example, a forecast of 10 years. And right away, we can see that we get a plot of our history here and our forecast on the future, which is based off of that reservoir model. And you can see that it generates out your forecast results, such as your EUR and your remaining recoverable gas as well. Now, we can say that we know the back pressure impacts the rate, and that's true. So the well's assuming a flowing pressure of around 443 psi into the future. Now, what if we wanted to schedule a compressor or something to reduce that pressure to something a lot lower, to, for example, 50 psi? Now, we can see that when I drop the pressure after a year, I will get a slight rate increase, as we can see here. So what we can actually do is sensitivities on different back pressures and see how the rate will actually benefit the response. So the final thing to show is the tables, and this is where you can see the tables for your Blasingame type curves, your history match, even your confidence limits and your forecasts as well. Now we can see that this is one interpretation that we've done. Now, what if I wanted to see my analytical model forecast on a decline curve, for example, and if I wanted to compare this with a traditional ARPS decline? What I can do is I can create a simple ARPS decline, so just a simple gas rate versus time decline. And we can see my decline. You can see the results from this decline giving me an EUR of around 2.2 BCF. Now, what if I wanted to compare that analytical model forecast to this traditional ARPS decline? Now, what I can do is I can simply select my analytical forecast, and now you can see exactly the comparison between my ARPS decline and my analytical forecast. And we can see the EUR is being given as around 2.4 BCF. So you can see the difference between traditional ARPS decline and a decline based off of an analytical forecast. So what I've shown you now is a very typical workflow for a conventional gas well. Now let's go back into the presentation and learn a little bit about the numerical models. Now, the advantages of our multi-phase numerical model combine those of analytical model and numerical modeling. So we'll talk a little bit more about our multi-phase numerical model coming up, but just taking a look at some key advantages of conducting numerical models. Now, numerical models are multi-phase, which means they allow you to model multi-phase flow in the reservoir. And this allows us to account for changes in fluid properties, saturations, and PVT correlations. There are no pseudo-time issues, and within our numerical models, you can also conduct some probabilistics. So this allows you to generate out your P90, your P50, and your P10 forecasts once you've completed the forecasting aspect of your model. And finally, the multi-phase numerical model is also the basis of our multi-well model, which we'll take a look at in detail. So what is the multi-phase numerical model? The new multi-phase numerical model has significant improvements in speed, and it incorporates pseudo-pressure not only for gas but for each of the fluids, which allows us to account for any changing fluid properties. It's very fast. A simulation of 30 years gas production can be done in a matter of seconds, and this substantially reduces the time required to history match the wells. You can get your results much quicker. The improvement in speed is because of a total rewrite of the simulator and the incorporation of pseudo-pressure. And as I've mentioned before, the pseudo-pressure allows us to account for the changing compressibility, viscosity of fluids with respect to pressure, and not only for gas, but for each of the fluids. Now, there are a number of things that make our model so fast while maintaining accuracy. And a few of these things include using fewer grid cells, which means the speed of the calculation would be increased by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, but we're still achieving the same degree of accuracy. Also, we're using optimized grid cell distribution and code optimization at every level. Lots of different reasons why the speed of our calculation has been increased. Now, taking a look at our multi-well numerical model, which I will demonstrate shortly, and this is also based on the same numerical model technology, and it allows for history matching and forecasting for groups of wells, while accounting for things like interference between the wells. Now, the current functionality allows for vertical completions and horizontal completions for aquifer support, so you can add a bottom aquifer or an edge aquifer, and we can also allow for both water and gas injection. Some key benefits of the multi-well numerical model include considering multi-phase flow in the reservoir. It also is very easy to set up than other commercial numerical models, and it runs a lot faster than other numerical models. That's the main beauty that we have here. We're achieving the same accuracy of results, but we're achieving them a lot faster so that you can get your results and analyze your results a lot quicker. In addition to this, the model can be used for both history matching and forecasting, and it can allow us to predict the impact of pressure support and how this impacts other wells. You can also view your pressure distributions and your fluid saturations through time, and you can forecast and develop scenarios which can easily be linked to economics to quickly assess your economic impacts. And we'll go into the software and actually take a look at a multi-well case. So what we really have is a fully integrated environment using our analytical and our numerical methods. So remember, when we're building that story, we always start off with our diagnostics. Once we've had a look at our data, we can then move on to our interpretation, and we can use a number of tools for our interpretation, including type curves and flowing material balance. Once we've got our interpretation, we can then put that interpretation into a model. And as we've had a look at, you can put them into analytical models, which are single phase, or numerical models. And within your numerical models, we can also conduct multi-well models. So you can identify key things such as interference if this is occurring between your wells. Now let's take a look at the theory behind multiple well analysis before we jump into the software with an example. Now we can analyze wells individually and we can analyze them as a group, and there's a number of ways that we can do that. We can use production decline plots, which we've seen from our traditional methods of analysis. We can use material balance analysis, both the static material balance and the flowing material balance. We can also use reservoir simulation and type curve approaches, such as the Blasingame, the Fetkovich, Agarwal-Gardner, which we've taken a look at in a previous webinar. Now, these methods are all what we've spoken about previously for individual wells, but now we're going to be taking a look at them as a group. So when is multi-well analysis required? So sometimes just doing a single well analysis or single well methods don't apply. When you have interference effects, for example, in your production and pressure data, doing just a single well analysis won't give you the most accurate results. You would need to do a multi-well analysis. When you have wells producing and shutting in at different times, and when you need a predictive tool for the entire reservoir, again, you can't just use your single well methods. Multi-well analysis also would work better when you have a complex reservoir behavior in the presence of multiple wells, so when you have multi-phase flow and multiple different reservoir heterogeneities. So when would it be required then? So group analysis is useful for scoping studies and in situations where quick answers are required, and you're interested in the total system behavior rather than just individual well behavior. So looking at an example here, multi-well analysis is great for identifying things like interference. So here we have two wells in the same reservoir, well A and well B, drilled side by side, and they're producing. If we have communication between these wells, we can actually see that when well B comes into production, we can actually see there's going to be an adjustment of the rate at well A, and we're going to see a response at well B. So to correct for interference in multi-well analysis, Blasingame actually came up with a method which defines a total material balance time function. And this takes into consideration the effect of the second well on the first. So for example, in the example that we just saw, if we think about well A, the total material balance time function will be cum divided by rate. But in this case, it will be cum A plus cum B divided by the rate of A. So in the type curve match, we're going to use this material balance time function instead of the original material balance time that we have. And this will allow us to correct for interference. So here we can see on the type curve plot that the material balance time is corrected for the interference caused by the production from well B. And this will align all of the data on the type curve. So looking at the type curves, we can see with well A how the type curve actually deviates downwards, indicating that there is interference in the well. But when we do a multi-well model type curve, it takes into account the interference effect and it will correct the data on the model. The same thing with FMB. We can see how the data curves downward when we don't take into account the interference effects. But when we do take them into consideration with the group as a whole, we can actually uncover the full potential of the well. So jumping into the multi-well example in the software. Now we've jumped into the software for the final example of this series. In this example, we will be doing a multi-well analysis on 3 gas interference wells. And we'll be taking a look at, by conducting a multi-well analysis, how this will allow us to correct for the interference that we have. We will take a look at the entire workflow that we've covered in this series, including the type curves, the flowing material balance, and numerical and analytical models as well. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is take a look at the 3 wells in the Diagnostics tab. So here we're going to take a look at when the wells come into production. So here we have well number 1 in yellow, and we can see that well number 1 comes on and is producing itself in the field. And well 2 then comes on in around about October 2007, and you start to see that slight decline there, and that's due to the interference effect. And then you have well number 3 in green, and this is the last well to come on stream at the end. Again, you see that trend going off slightly due to the interference effect. So RTA can help you to identify things such as interference. So let's have a look at each well individually, starting off with well number 1. We're going to start off by taking a look at the type curves. So I can simply select the type curve that I want to take a look at. It's always a good thing when you're identifying things like interference to have a look at each well or analyze each well individually first before going ahead and analyzing the well as a group. So I have my data here, and all I have to do is match my data to the type curve, like so, and I can select the automatic type curve selection. And this will generate out my bulk parameters such as my permeability and my skin. Now, if you remember before or earlier when we took a look at the diagnostics, we were able to see when each well came on stream. Well number 2 actually came on stream in October 2007. So we can actually put this on our type curve to help us to identify exactly when that interference effect occurred. So I can select my filter tunnel and apply a linked annotation at around October 2007. And I can rename this. And now I can see exactly which point my well number 2 came on stream. And you can see from the type curve itself, my data is starting to fall off of the unit slope. This actually indicates that you have interference occurring. So let's then go ahead and do the flowing material balance. Now, the flowing material balance is a plot of normalized rate versus normalized cumulative production. That's the Agarwal-Gardner flowing material balance. I'm going to plot the flowing P over Z to visualize my data in a slightly different way. And I'm going to select the points before the interference effect occurred. And this will then generate out my cumulative gas production prior to the interference effect. And you can see here that well number 2, the annotation where I said that well number 2 came on stream, has actually been carried forward to my flowing material balance. So I can actually see exactly the points where my interference effect occurred. I can also put on my productivity index. Productivity index monitors the health of the well. And again, you can see that it's fairly flat before that interference effect occurs. But as soon as that interference effect occurs, you can see the trend going completely off. Flowing material balance will provide me with my drainage area of around 620 acres and an original gas in place of around 21 BCF. The next thing I'd want to do is create an analytical model. Analytical models are single phase, so they don't take into account any changing saturations, relative permeabilities, or PVT properties. So I can simply create my gas analytical model, and I'm going to seed in my parameters from my Agu-Gardner type curve. Now we can see when I do that, the software will automatically create a history match. Now, what we can do is we can manually iterate on specific parameters to see just how sensitive they are. So for example, if I was to change my skin value to 0, you can see that that made a slight difference to my history match. I can change my permeability. Let's do a drastic change to about 14 millidarcy. You can see how big of a change that made to my history match. If I make a drastic change the other way, for example, 2 millidarcy, again, you can see that that's made a drastic change. So its permeability is very sensitive to the history match in this case. So what I can do is I can also select my permeability parameter and select the automatic parameter estimation. And this will then automatically iterate on this parameter to provide me with the best history match. Now, it's important to note that this well is actually showing interference effects, and we may not want to include that dropping off or that interference effect in our history match. So what we actually have is a weight, where you can weight specific data points and choose to history match on those data points. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to weight on all the data points prior to that interference effect coming in. And once I've done that, I can then select my APE again, automatic parameter estimation, and this will now iterate on those weighted data points to give me the best history match. So I'm happy with that. This has given me a sufficient history match. So the next thing then that I'd want to do is go ahead and conduct a numerical model. So I can select the new worksheet tab and select multi-phase numerical model. So I'm going through the entire workflow, starting off with the Blasingame type curve, going on to the flowing material balance, then the analytical model, and now the multi-phase numerical model. So I can select black oil and remove the oil from the model. I can simply feed in my parameters from my analytical model. And when I do this, the software will automatically begin creating that history match. You can see that automatically using those parameters from the analytical model, it's not given me a great history match. I can start to change specific parameters manually to see how that will help me gain a better history match. So if I increase my permeability to around about 10 millidarcy, we can see that that's actually given me a much better history match. We have that falling off due to the interference effect, so the latter part of the data doesn't match. So there we have it. We have our Blasingame model, our FMB, our analytical model, and then our numerical model. So we then can move on to well number 2 and conduct the exact same workflow for well number 2 and well number 3. And I've actually done that to save time. So I've conducted a Agu-Gardner type curve, and you can see again, you have that interference effect. So that drop away from the unit slope. And that's because this is where well number 3 begins to come on stream. So type curves are great for identifying these kind of diagnostics. You can then go on to the flowing material balance. And again, you can see that same interference effect when you apply that flowing material balance. You can then go ahead and do the analytical model and the numerical model. Again, here I weighted those data points to create a better history match, and going on to the numerical model, I got these history matches by adjusting the permeability and the skin inputs for those producing wells. Same with well number 3, same workflow, starting off with the type curve. Now this time it's important to note that there's no falling off from the unit slope on the type curves here. And this is because this is actually the last well to come on stream, so we don't see any interference effects from any other wells. Same thing with the flowing material balance. It gives you a nice perfect flowing P over Z, and if you plot the productivity index, it's fairly flat, indicating that we don't face any productivity issues with this well. We go on to do the analytical model, the single phase analytical model, giving us a nice history match, and the numerical model, which is again giving us a nice history match. So once we've conducted the single well analyses for each of these wells, we can then create a group and conduct a multi-well analysis. So I've created a group in the entity viewer at the bottom here. If I just maximize this, you can see that the 3 of the wells are actually available in this group. Now we want to start off by creating a group flowing material balance to give us a drainage area. So we're going to go to the Groups tab, select the tab, go to our gas flowing material balance. Now if I maximize this flowing material balance, I can simply select the points that I'd like to include. Like so. And this will then generate out my area in acres, in this case is 642, and my original gas in place of around 21 BCF. Now, if you remember, my original gas in place was the same when I did the single well analysis on well number 1. And this is because this is being used as the primary well. And this is the primary well because it's seen the furthest into the reservoir since it came on production first. So we've got this information from our flowing material balance. Now, there are a couple of other options that you can take a look at here. One is the multi-phase option. Now, the multi-phase flowing material balance takes into account a pseudo pressure, and this takes into account changing PVT properties, relative permeabilities, and saturations that may be changing. And it uses a pseudo pressure to help us to account for these changing properties. Now you can put on things like your gas rate from the flowing material balance model when you select that multi-phase. And this can actually help you to identify exactly where you should place your line. So if, for example, if I was to change my analysis line here, you can see that my match on my gas rate also changes. If I change it to down here, again, the match changes. So this can really help me to place the analysis line in a place that will give me the best match on my gas rate as well. So the next thing you can do then is to conduct a multi-well analysis. And you can navigate to the Group tab and select the multi-phase multi-well model and select your model. Now it's super simple to create. I'm just going to take away the oil from this model because we're using gas wells. Now it's really easy to seed in the parameters for each of your wells. I can simply seed in my parameters from my numerical models that I've just created for each of my wells, and this will seed in my permeability values, skin values, and saturations. Now, if we remember, the numerical model is a multi-phase model, so it takes into account those changing relative permeability curves, saturations, and PVT properties. In the analytical model, we use the effective permeability, but now we're using the absolute permeability because we're looking at using the relative permeability curves. Now, if you remember, the area we got from the flowing material balance was 636 acres, and we want to maintain that area in the multi-well model as well. There's a couple of ways you can do that. You can simply type in your drainage area here to 636 acres, or you can actually change the reservoir boundary or the shape of the reservoir boundary yourself manually to increase or decrease that drainage area. So if you see, as I'm changing the reservoir boundary, the value of my drainage area on the left-hand side will actually be changing. Now, another option that you have is to bring in a shapefile. And when you bring in a shapefile, you can actually then match the reservoir boundaries to the shapefile so that you get a more accurate drainage area. So I've got all the parameters for my multi-well model ready. The next thing to do is simulate the model. So go back to my well number 1 and simulate. Now at this point, you do get some very pretty colors. I can turn on the well regions to show these are what separate each permeability and net pay. I can also turn on the cell regions and see how the cells automatically set up for your gradient like this. I can also take a look at my pressure, gas, oil, water saturations through time as well for each of my wells. Now you can see that when I conducted the numerical model, it created some history matches. So this is for well number 1, well number 2, and well number 3. The final thing that I can do is create a forecast into the future. So for example, I can create a forecast for 12 months, which is 1 year into the future. I'm going to choose to step the gas rates, 2.5 million standard cubic feet for each of the wells. For well number 2, 0.8, and for well number 3, around 6. And then I can simply simulate. And this will now forecast for a year into the future with those steps for each gas rate. So you can get your EURs, your gas production, gas injection, remaining recoverables, etc. Now the final thing to show is the Agrawal-Gardner type curve for this group analysis. If I create an Agrawal-Gardner type curve and place my data on the type curve, we can now see that when we do a type curve for the group analysis, all of the data fits nicely on the type curve. There's no interference issues or diagnostics that we can see on the type curve. And this is because we're taking the productivity of one well and we're using all of the cumulative production from all of the wells. And this will actually bring everything back into line. Now the primary well used is well number 1, and this is because this is the well that has seen into the reservoir the furthest as it was on production for the longest period of time. You can actually change the primary well if you wish for it to be well number 2 or well number 3. We can do the same thing with the flowing material balance. And you can see everything is brought back into line nicely, and it will give you a cumulative gas production of around 21 BCF for the entire field. So that will conclude going through the multi-well analysis. We've taken a look at the type curves, the flowing material balance, the analytical model, the numerical model, and then the full multi-well model. When you're analysing things like interference, it's always a good idea to analyse each well individually first before going through and analysing the wells as a group. So thank you for tuning into the last webinar of this series. In this series, we covered the fundamentals of rate transient analysis. We started off by taking a look at the traditional methods of analysis and moved on to take a look at some RTA methods such as type curves and flowing material balance. We then finished by taking a look at modelling, both analytical, numerical, and multi-well modelling. Please don't hesitate to contact me if anyone has any questions on anything provided in this series. Thank you.